Hey everyone, James here from TDB. As you can tell, you can't even see my tea table right now because we are doing something a little different today. This is the second episode of Reddit Quick Takes, where I kind of look at some of the popular Reddit posts from the last, few months or so, and just kind of give my quick thoughts on them. And it's just a good way for me to kind of get a feel for what people are asking in the community. As you get a little deeper into tea, you tend to get a little bit disconnected, at least that's my personal experience, from what people are talking about and stuff like that. And so, just wanted to get a quick pulse on what people are doing. My favorite is to search, these are all from Reddit puer, and which can be, kind of a snippy place at times, and I like to sometimes sort by most controversial, just to get different ones. If it's like a picture of tea or something like that, I don't really have much to add to that discussion, but the ones that tend to get people all fired up and stuff tend to be kind of the more interesting topics, or at least they can be. Let's get into this. Gonna start my screen recording right now here over on OBS. All right, so we are recording. All right, so here we are. I just kind of compiled a couple of these, and it's been it's been like a week since I looked at this. What are the benefits of buying a 2022 puer? There are vendors that selling 2021, 22 cakes that pressing into Malchon cakes, leaving it in the warehouse for a few months has fundamentally changed them. See many current cakes being sold at ridiculously high prices at some tea vendors that will go unnamed. I actually don't know exactly what they're referring to. I haven't kept up with kind of the contemporary puer that's being released every year. I will say that a benefit for me is if I want to get a tea that doesn't have an aged taste and is fresh, I find myself going to 1 to 5 year aged puer as opposed to black, green, or oolong lately. Camellia sinensis has a bunch of great priced young cakes, and I love the nuance of the artisanship of any puer that's been well put together. I found this to be a recent change in my palate when there seems to be a puer or an aged right for any craving that may strike. Why would you personally buy a 2021-2022 puer if you do yourself? For me at least, I think the only reason to buy those teas really, I guess there's two reasons. One, if you like drinking them, which in case you should buy them. I don't think they're going to change super fast overnight, but you should drink them up within a couple of years. I would probably recommend storing them in Mylar in such a case. Or if you want to treat it like an experiment where you are kind of aging tea from the start and onwards. That can be a very long experiment. Tea generally ages quite slowly, certainly even more so in most Western climates. So you would just need to be prepared for kind of the very long haul. I recently filmed an episode where I revisited a cake. I'm not sure if I would have released this episode or not, because I don't know the order of which I'm releasing stuff, but the tea just ages very, very slowly out here. So you need to really be prepared for thinking about like that 15 to 20 year time horizon, which is a long time. It's a long time to plan for anything, but if you are a hobbyist and you're kind of just interested in trying out something for fun as like kind of a project, I have a couple teas like that. I would do that. But it is also absolutely true, in my opinion, that the better value, especially for those people that prefer tea that is more on the aged end, is to not buy tea that is super young. I don't think there's great value there, generally speaking, and I think you can find that much more easily when you start to look at tea that's a little bit older. 7+ years is usually what I cite. It's been a little bit since I bought tea, but you can usually find some teas from kind of the mid to late 2000s that are pretty reasonable. And those teas at this point are kind of getting in that 10 to 15, well, no longer than that, almost 20 years for some of these teas too. So, that's what I would say. All right, let's go. Does anyone else mix shung and show? All right, so let's see. Does anyone else mix mediocre shung and show? I found that when I have some mediocre shung and show, mixing them can improve things a little. The resulting cup of tea certainly isn't great, but it's definitely an improvement over the sum part. Anyone else do this? I do not do this, but I don't think it's a bad idea at all. I think there's a reason why a lot of the most interesting teas are blends. It's because you can kind of put different things together. There's actually a historical precedent to this too. They used to make kind of ripe, raw, shung, ripe mixes and stuff like that. So if you find some of those older cakes, pretty rare to find these days, but it did used to be kind of a thing that happened in, I think, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Probably, I think the most I've seen are kind of like 80s and 90s. So it's not a bad thing to do. And the reason you could do it is the show can often provide kind of like the base of the smoothness and stuff like that. And maybe your raw is like a little too aggressive, or stuff like that. So if you can mix that bitterness in with the show, can be just kind of a nice combination. One of my favorite kind of more modern ripes that's been released is by Yunnan Sourcing, the Bawang tea. What I really like about that tea is how there's this kind of strong streak of bitterness that's clearly coming from certain material that's blended in. And taken alone, I'm not really a fan of those like very, very bitter material ripe teas, but mixed in with that with some other material, probably from Munghai County too, I do find it to be quite enjoyable. So that's a tea that I do like, and it's not exactly quite the same thing as ripe or raw, but I think some of the concepts behind that are probably pretty similar. Okay, so let's close these, and let's go and take a look at this next one. Okay, I do remember this one. I want to start aging cakes and need advice on a Pu'erh. I want to start buying relatively new raw cakes and store them for aging. Already talked about that a couple questions ago and why that might not be the best value. But so I know that many of you have a wealth of wisdom in this area, so your advice would be appreciated. I'm fully prepared to make a couple of Pu'erhs. I've heard of people using mini fridges and wine coolers as well as plastic bins. He likes the idea of going towards higher end items. The climate where I am in Canada can range from 104 Fahrenheit and 90% humidity in summer to negative 20 at 20 to 40% humidity in winter and virtually everything in between. This is why he wants to set up a Pu'erh so he can control the temperature and humidity. Ready to spend up to 200 USD. He has a couple edits here. Going to expand his storage as the years go by to 100 plus cakes as a retirement investment. But I need a starting point. Please assume I have no idea how to store puer at all, as that's fairly close to the truth. Edit 2, alright, bad retirement plan. That sounds like you got some good advice. But how about the ones I'd like to attempt to age for my own enjoyment? Okay, yeah, very much a hobbyist thing to do. It's not worth the space-time effort. It's a rather poor bet, I would say, for retirement. So I'm glad to see people kind of dissuade him from that. So one thing that absolutely needs to happen is you need to measure these the conditions within the area you intend to store pu'er. You cannot judge from the outside weather conditions, and I see this happening way too much, and it always seems to happen. These posts kind of cycle and recycle every couple of years. People that think they have a good idea. Your outside conditions are going to be very, very different from your inside conditions, so do not read too much. You'll get an inflated sense of your humidity, most likely, because in the winter, most people are heating their homes, and in the summer, people may or may not use AC, which can dry out your home as well. So all these things will make your climate just very, very different inside and outside. And I've never really encountered someone that has conditions that really mirror the inside and the outside. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I would say that that would be more of the exception to the rule there. So yeah, I think the easiest way to do this is probably a Mylar, and that kind of depends how much you believe in Mylar and kind of airflow and stuff like that. But that's usually what I do recommend to people these days, is to store their tea in Mylar, because I think it's the easiest to kind of control the conditions, requires the least amount of like setup and stuff like that. Yeah, and I think a couple places you could go wrong are if you want to like go in style, buying like really nice wood cabinets. Sounds great. You need to be very careful of the wood and imposing aromas and stuff like that. So protecting teas from aromas, definitely very important, and not kind of imparting certain smells. And I would say when I have come across home stored pu'er in the West, almost all of them have had like a particular house smell to them that's specific to them. There's like one that may or may not be like a vape flavor, vape aroma that I've encountered. Some of them have kind of like this interesting woody smell, and I don't know if that comes from people's houses or stuff like that, but aroma is definitely, I think, sometimes can get a little underrated, just because people are like, oh yeah, aroma, of course. But that, as well as kind of the temperature and humidity component to it. So absolutely measure, and generally Mylar is what I would recommend towards people just getting started. Okay, so I don't get why some people here say it's so hard to age tea in the West. From a Google search about dry storage, the proper idea of humidity and temperature for dry storage will vary, usually falling somewhere between 60 to 70 relative humidity and 60 to 70 Fahrenheit. There are conditions you achieve in homes, Central Europe, just by the steam that's created by regular tea brew and store in the same room, and some ventilation. So what is the fuss about? The local tea seller I know of also stores puers in the open. I don't know much about tea storage, but they surely do. Also, dry storage seems to be the main interest. No. Other sources say 50-70%, so it's definitely doable without getting issues with mold. Talking about the lower bound, due to the way some Redditors react, I'm guessing that the fuss is about some people who made puer aging their religion, refusing anything that deviates from their doctrines. There are also reasonable answers, but this comment section really proved to me that I should put more trust in other sources and less on the sub. The majority seem to be more emotional than rational. Well then, someone got a little salty there. Okay, so in general, you need to measure what's going on inside your home. It's easy to do. You just get a reliable hygrometer and you measure that stuff. It's crazy to me that people, you have to measure it. You don't know what your inside conditions are. I have not ran into many inside conditions that have that level of humidity regularly, 60 to 70%. At the highest in here, I'm getting something like 60%. And that's in a really condensed living room with steam. And that's the absolute highest in a relatively humid place. So I don't live in Central Europe, but Seattle I don't think is too terribly different from certain locations in Europe. So I don't think those conditions are terribly common to achieve. Maybe if you are regularly steaming your room, I think the humidity in particular is the part that, sure, I mean, you can get to 60, 70 Fahrenheit. That's a pretty normal room temperature. But getting kind of that humidity consistently at that level, I think, is pretty rare. So I think it is something where you do need to fuss about it in order to get that. I would also say that 50 to 70 is, I would say 50 to 60 is absolutely on the low end. I would not store my tea at 50 to 60 relative humidity. I think the tea will probably dry out at the lower end of that. So I would say that 60 is very different from 50, and 60 is also very different from 70. So, and I would say 60 is probably the absolute low end that I would go. So I think more like 65 is something that I personally aim for. So I think if we're a little loosey and goosey with those numbers, then you could kind of settle on something that sounds reasonable but isn't really, especially if we're like, 50 is fine. I have not been a fan of teas when they're stored at RH so low. Okay, the local tea stores I know of also store their poo when they're open. I don't know much about tea storage, but they surely do. No, that's not a good assumption at all. In my experience, local tea sellers don't necessarily know much about puer and their storage. They may assume what works in Hong Kong or Taiwan would work, and the climates are just too different to work in such a way. Puer is very much a specialty product too, so these are tea sellers and not specifically puer specialists. They are people that are kind of probably dabbling in something that maybe is not the primary focus of their business. So if their business is to mostly sell tea, puer is probably something that is kind of small in comparison to the main interest. So I don't know for sure, but I would certainly not assume that local tea sellers know what they're talking about. Also, dry storage seems to be the main interest. No, I think dry storage ends up being the main interest primarily because it is the easiest to do. I think it's even harder to recreate conditions that are on the more humid end unless you live somewhere very specific to that. And even then, I think if you're in Florida or Houston or somewhere that's on the humid side of things, I think it'd be still pretty darn difficult to emulate something beyond dry storage. So I think dry storage ends up being the main interest because it's the easiest. It certainly is for me. I prefer tea that is not necessarily the most dryly stored, but I am aiming for dry storage because that requires less fuss and is easier for me to do too. So those are some of the things I would say to this person who got a lot of different comments on this, apparently. Difference between Hong Kong and Malaysian or Taiwanese. Okay, for some reason, traditional Hong Kong storage seems to be the one that lends that very, very particular characteristic, but there's no way that can be purely down to climate. I wonder if the Kunming versus HK thing really tends to focus everyone on climate. Anyway, the latitude of Malaysia will tell you that is consistently as warm and humid as Hong Kong summer. Hong Kong only has a short cool season, perhaps lasting 3 to 4 months. So in purely climate terms, in terms of exposure to heat and humidity, 1 year in Malaysia is probably about 75% of a year in Hong Kong. But it's quite clear that, say, a 15-year stored HK cake is not going to be the equivalent of a 10-year stored Malaysian cake. No one seems to treat Malaysia as a way of accelerating HK type storage, and then Taiwan, which to a close enough approximation has a similar climate to HK. But there's not a cachet about Taiwan storage. Not sure exactly what they mean there. So what is special about HK storage is not just the climate. What else were they doing? Is it something about the warehouses having especially poor ventilation, or is it just that HK storage got a name before Taiwan and Malaysia? Pretty interesting post. I would say the main thing here is methodology is very important. Historically speaking, Hong Kong definitely is kind of like leading the way as far as pu'er goes, in terms of like they were the group of people most associated with drinking it in the 70s and 80s with dim sum and stuff like that, which is very much kind of a Cantonese thing. And then Taiwan became kind of more known for their involvement in the pu'er industry and started restarting it in Yunnan with like Yiwu and stuff like that, and buying a whole lot of tea from Hong Kong before the Hong Kong handover in 1997. So I think that's why Hong Kong does kind of have this like a little bit of a big reputation as far as pu'er goes, and I think it is well deserved. But yeah, as far as this question goes, the methodology I think is important. I think they're pretty much more or less correct on what they're talking about and the way they describe these climates. So Taiwan, Hong Kong, not exactly the same, but they're pretty close as far as that goes. And I do think if you had natural storage where people are following pretty similar methodologies for those two, I think you'll probably end up with something that's, by approximation, pretty close. I think the main difference is that Hong Kong really is known for that traditional storage, and the methodology is just very different there, where they are storing the teas in kind of these places that are very poorly ventilated and can be quite hot and humid, and it's a method that would kind of be mimicked with ripe and stuff like that later on, and then they're storing it and drying it out more. So I think the main thing here is the Hong Kong traditional versus Malaysian natural or Taiwan natural. And I think when we talk about Taiwan natural and Hong Kong natural, they're probably pretty close together. Malaysian natural, as they say, Malaysia is actually probably more hot and humid than Hong Kong, which is accurate. If you had natural Malaysian storage, it would probably mature the tea even faster than natural Hong Kong storage. It's only the traditional Hong Kong storage and kind of the methods that people are storing them that kind of make that difference. So methodology, very, very important, and there are certain locations that are just more associated with certain methodologies, specifically when it comes to Hong Kong. All right, so let's go here. How does age affect pu'er past 10 years? I've been wondering this. I've never sampled anything older than 10 years. This caffeine, their compounds begin to degrade at a certain age in pu'er. So at what point? I have a 2003 Yiwu Shangtai on its way, and I'm wondering what I'm in for. It will be by far the oldest pu'er I've ever had by about 10 years. Beyond 10 years, what happens as pu'er ages? I'm thinking taste, texture, body, sensation. Yeah, so this is one of the funny things to me about pu'er in general is there's so much young pu'er that gets out there, and people tend to just try that stuff a lot more when they get introduced to the tea, that you'll often miss out on tea that's older. And in my opinion, older pu'er has a much greater variety than young pu'er. I mean, when we're talking about young pu'er, age doesn't become a factor, so we can just focus solely on certain characteristics, like is it blend, the terroir, like the location where it's grown, stuff like that. But when we get to pu'er that's aged, we have all those different things still. All that thing remains. It still could be like an Yiwu tea versus like an Eastern Monghai County tea, like a Guofang Jai versus Monghai County. So there's still, all of that same variety is still there, as well as storage and age, and how tea was stored and whatnot. So yeah, let's see. Let's try to break this down. Does caffeine and other compounds begin to degrade at a certain age in pu'er? Generally speaking, what I believe is the answer is not really. I suppose it's possible at a certain point, but I've never been particularly convinced that the caffeine and stuff breaks down. I do think you're going to kind of get a little bit more of a mellow taste as these teas age. It's unclear to me if that has anything to do with caffeine. I would guess probably not. So they're getting a tea on the way. That's from 2003. That's great. What happens as pu'er ages? I'm thinking taste, texture, body sensation, etc. So generally the tea will mellow out. So kind of those higher notes and stuff like that, depending on how the tea is stored, they will evolve and change. Usually teas that are young are kind of like more floral, higher notes. And as you get older, like the kind of the polar opposite, that is like more Hong Kong traditional, so very humidly stored, pu'er, if we're to simplify it. Those tend to take on like earthier, more lower noted, bassier notes. So those are kind of the polar opposites. And then you have everything that's absolutely in between. So huge variety of semi-aged and aged pu'er. So I would highly recommend people check the different teas out from there. Try a tea that's 10 years old, try a tea that's 20 years old if you can. Try all the different storages, dry storage, more humid, natural storage. And then of course traditional storage from some place like Eon. All those things are all worth trying and all can create quite a different tea, even when we're all starting from the same material there. So and different eras will age differently too. So try Iwu tea that's 15 years old, try Munghai Tao tea that's 15 years old, try Northern tea that's 15 years old, different factories and whatnot too. So I would say that just generally speaking, it will mellow it out. For me, I prefer tea as it generally ages. As it, I do think I tend to like tea when it's a little smoother and not too rough. There are other reasons too that people prefer more aged tea. I think it's easier on the stomach, generally speaking. I've never had stomach issues with raw pu'er, but there are a lot of people that have, so don't want to discount that either. I would say do check out just kind of a wide variety of pu'er. Sorry, tailing off there a little bit. So I think that's the last Reddit post that I have to cover. So thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you enjoyed this episode. If you would like another episode of Reddit Quick Takes, there's only so many posts that people do that I think are worth commenting on. So probably something I'm only going to do every few months. But if you enjoyed it, please do comment. If you agree or disagree with any specific topic, happy to hear from you there too. Thank you all for tuning in. I will see you all next time.